Most people imagine the journey to heaven as a staircase, steep, demanding, exhausting, a path that only the strongest, the most disciplined, the most virtuous can ascend. They picture holiness as something that requires climbing, one moral achievement after another, one perfect prayer piled on top of the next, one rung of spiritual effort after another, and many souls, seeing the height of the staircase, quietly despair. But Saint Thérèse of Lisieux looked at that same staircase and made a decision that shocked even herself. She refused to climb it, not out of laziness, not out of irreverence, but because she discovered something radical about the heart of God, something so simple, so disarming, and so transformative that it would reshape Christian spirituality forever. Let me ask you something honestly. Have you ever felt discouraged because you believed you would never be holy enough for God? Have you ever looked at the spiritual lives of others and thought, they're climbing higher than I ever could? Have you ever felt that heaven was for the strong while you remained painfully aware of your weakness? Thérèse felt this deeply. She knew she did not have the heroic stamina of the great ascetics. She did not possess the towering mystical visions of the more celebrated saints. She saw herself as small, emotionally, spiritually, even physically. And for a long time, she felt that her smallness was a spiritual disadvantage, until she realized it was the key. The shortcut to heaven is not found at the top of the staircase. It is found in refusing to climb it at all. Thérèse saw something others missed. Children do not climb into their parents' arms. They are lifted. Holiness, she discovered, is not achieved by scaling great heights, but by consenting to be carried. Once she understood this, everything changed. She stopped measuring her progress. She stopped fearing her limitations. She stopped comparing herself to the giants of the spiritual life. Instead, she trusted in the mercy of God with a confidence that bordered on audacity. She believed that the way to heaven was not the way of spiritual athleticism, but the way of surrender, not climbing, allowing, not proving, receiving, not performing, belonging. Thérèse believed that God bends down with tenderness toward the smallest souls, not to reward their efforts, but to lift them because they cannot lift themselves. This is the shortcut to heaven. The soul that knows it cannot climb is the soul God carries highest. And in discovering this truth, Thérèse found a peace others spend a lifetime chasing. She no longer feared her imperfections. They became the very places grace could take hold. She no longer worried about her weakness. It became the bridge by which God reached her. She no longer saw heaven as a challenge to conquer. She saw it as a gift to receive. The stairs were never meant for her, and perhaps they were never meant for you either. There is a moment in every sincere soul's life when it realizes that the path it has been struggling to climb may not be the one God intended. A moment when exhaustion becomes revelation, when the heart finally admits it cannot sustain the weight of constant spiritual effort. And in that fragile confession, something unexpected happens. Grace becomes visible. Let me ask you something delicately. Have you ever tried so hard to grow spiritually that your efforts left you more tired than transformed? Have you ever pushed yourself to pray perfectly, behave perfectly, believe perfectly, only to feel further from God instead of closer? This was the inner conflict that shaped Saint Thérèse of Lisieux's early spiritual life. She wanted to reach God with all her heart, but every path she saw before her seemed impossibly steep. She admired the saints who climbed with heroic discipline, yet she sensed that her own nature, sensitive, emotional, easily overwhelmed, could never imitate them. She felt destined to remain at the bottom of the staircase. But then something utterly revolutionary dawned upon her. Perhaps the problem was not her weakness. Perhaps the problem was the staircase. Thérèse realized that God never asked her to become a spiritual athlete. He asked only for her love. And love does not climb. Love yields. Love allows itself to be carried wherever the beloved desires. Love trusts the one who lifts. This shift did not happen instantly. It unfolded slowly, quietly, in the hidden interior of her heart. She began to notice that whenever she tried to ascend through effort alone, she felt anxious, burdened, and discouraged. But whenever she admitted her smallness to God, whenever she allowed herself to be exactly who she was, without pretending to be stronger or holier than reality, something beautiful happened inside her. She felt peace. She felt seen. She felt God drawing near, not because she was achieving, but because she was surrendering. Holiness, she discovered, was not a ladder. It was a relationship in which God always made the first move. Thérèse started to look at her own weaknesses differently. Instead of treating them as obstacles to God, she began to see them as places where God desired to show his love most tenderly. Her smallness became her offering, not perfection, not success, not spiritual triumphs, but the humble truth of who she really was, and God responded to that truth. She realized something astonishing. The souls who climb high often climb alone, relying on their strength. But the souls who admit their inability open a space for God to act. The ones who try to lift themselves exhaust their energy. The ones who stretch out their arms in trust become weightless in His. This insight became the foundation of her entire little way. She refused the stairway not because she lacked ambition, but because she understood the heart of God too well to mistake effort for intimacy. In her surrender, she found a shortcut. In her weakness, she found a doorway. In her smallness, she found the arms that would carry her, and the soul who consents to be carried, she believed, rises higher than the soul who climbs. There is a paradox at the center of the spiritual life that many people never discover. Sometimes, the harder you try to reach God, the further you feel from Him. Not because effort is wrong, but because effort alone can become a barrier, one built from anxiety, self-reliance, and the fear of disappointing Him. This paradox tormented countless souls, but Thérèse of Lisieux found the key that unlocks it. Before she found her little way, Thérèse lived with a pressure familiar to many today, the pressure to be holy enough. She believed that God was watching her closely, evaluating her strength, waiting for her to reach some spiritual height before He could truly draw near. And every time she failed, or faltered, or felt emotionally fragile, she assumed she was letting God down. Let me ask you something sincerely. Have you ever felt guilty for being tired, human, emotional, inconsistent in prayer, as if these qualities made you less lovable to God? Have you ever believed holiness required constant striving, constant proving, constant inner performance? Thérèse thought the same, until God showed her something that shattered that illusion. Trying to climb to God by your own strength keeps you focused on yourself. Letting God carry you keeps you focused on Him. This realization changed everything for her. As long as she tried to climb the metaphorical staircase to heaven, she felt the weight of her inadequacies. Every missed prayer felt like a failure. Every moment of sadness felt like regression. Every weakness felt like a reason God might withdraw His affection. Her spiritual life became exhausting, full of effort, but empty of peace. Then, in prayer, she saw a different path. A path not built on self-sufficiency, but on trust. Not on ascension, but on surrender. She came to understand that God never expected her to climb to Him. He expected her to allow Him to descend to her. This was her shortcut. And here lies the paradox. The more she let go of trying to be perfect, the closer she felt to God. Her weaknesses no longer frightened her. Her imperfections no longer defined her. Her efforts were no longer about proving something. They became expressions of love offered freely, without pressure. She realized that God is far less interested in what you can accomplish for Him, and far more interested in how much you allow Him to love you in your smallness. Holiness, she discovered, is not the result of perfection of character, but perfection of trust. Not climbing higher, but resting deeper. Not showing God your strength, but exposing your need. This is why Thérèse refused the stairs, not because she lacked courage, but because she understood the essence of divine love better than the climbers did. She knew that God lifts the humble, the poor in spirit, the spiritually childlike. And so she stopped striving and discovered peace. She stopped climbing and discovered closeness. She stopped trying to impress God and discovered intimacy. In surrender, she met the God she had been trying so hard to reach, and in letting Him carry her, she rose higher than any self-built ladder could ever take her. There is a moment in the spiritual journey when the soul realizes it is too small to reach God on its own, not in a despairing way, but in a way that finally tells the truth that the distance between heaven and earth is infinite, The truth that no amount of discipline, prayer, or interior effort can bridge that gap by human strength. And the truth that God never intended for the soul to bridge it alone. Let me ask you something quietly. Have you ever felt that no matter how hard you try to grow spiritually, something in you remains fragile, inconsistent, or painfully human? Have you ever felt frustrated by how quickly you return to the same weaknesses, as if holiness is always just out of reach? Thérèse felt this too. But instead of letting this discouragement destroy her hope, she allowed it to illuminate something much deeper, the reality that smallness was not a spiritual handicap, it was a spiritual identity. The world admires the strong, but God draws nearest to the small. It was in this revelation that her little way came alive. She understood that her inability to climb toward God was not a failure, but an invitation, because where she lacked strength, God desired to give himself. Where she felt incapable, God wanted to carry. Where she felt unworthy, God longed to pour out mercy. This is why she refused the staircase, because she discovered something better than climbing, the lift of divine love. Thérèse used an image that shocked many. Instead of climbing stairs heroically, she imagined herself as a little child standing at the bottom of a giant staircase, simply lifting her arms toward her Father. Not in demand, not in entitlement, just with the trust that love always descends to the smallest. And she believed God would do what any loving father does, bend down, pick up the child, and lift her high. This was not fantasy to Thérèse, it was theology lived with astounding simplicity. She realized that the shortcut to heaven was not effort, it was cooperation with grace, not climbing, but allowing oneself to be lifted, not striving upward, but resting in the arms that come downward. This is the lift only small souls experience, souls that admit they cannot climb, souls that embrace their limits without shame, souls that believe dependence is not weakness, but relationship. Thérèse insisted that God delights in lifting those who cannot lift themselves, not because he pities them, but because their smallness creates room for him to be everything. The giants of the spiritual life may ascend through discipline, but the little ones ascend through surrender. And here lies the paradox. The little ones rise higher, not by their strength, not by their brilliance, not by their achievements, but by the tenderness of a God who notices the smallest souls most personally. When Thérèse discovered this, she felt a freedom she had never known. Her weaknesses no longer felt like burdens. Her imperfections no longer felt like barriers. Her smallness became her path, her identity, her gift. And she realized almost with wonder that heaven is not far from the small. It is the small who are closest to being carried into it. There is a truth about divine love that many souls resist, not because they don't believe it, but because they feel too unworthy to accept it. Holiness begins not when you love God greatly, but when you allow God to love you beyond what you think you deserve. This is the foundation of the shortcut Thérèse found, the surprising realization that receiving love is far more transformative than trying to generate it. Let me ask you with sincerity, have you ever felt uncomfortable with the idea that God loves you deeply, even when you fail, even when you fall short, even when you bring him nothing but need? Have you ever sensed that your instinct is to earn his love rather than simply receive it? Thérèse knew this instinct well. She spent years trying to offer God the kind of holiness she imagined he desired, a strong, flawless, heroic love. But each attempt left her more discouraged. The harder she tried to be admirable, the more she discovered her own limits. Her sensitivity, emotional fragility, and spiritual instability seemed to follow her everywhere. But then, something astonishing happened. She realized that God was not asking her to be worthy of love. He was asking her to accept love. This became the heart of her little way. It was a shift from effort to openness, from performance to presence, from climbing to allowing herself to be carried. She saw that the greatest obstacle to holiness was not weakness, but the belief that weakness made her unlovable. Thérèse's breakthrough came in a moment of radical clarity. God loves the soul not because it climbs, but because it consents to be held, not because it achieves, but because it surrenders. Not because it is flawless, but because it is willing to trust a love stronger than its failures. And this is where the hidden power lies. When the soul allows itself to be loved more than it deserves, something inside it begins to change, quietly, almost imperceptibly. It becomes softer. It becomes freer. It becomes more courageous. It stops running from its imperfections and begins offering them as places where God can show his tenderness. This is why Thérèse said the boldest act of holiness is not doing great deeds, but daring to believe that God's mercy is bigger than your smallness. To accept undeserved love is to dethrone fear. To allow God to love you in weakness is to defeat shame. To rest in his compassion is to break the cycle of striving. Thérèse realized that when she stopped trying to impress God, she finally discovered him, not as a demanding judge, but as a father eager to lift his little ones. Her soul found a peace she had never known, not because she became stronger, but because she stopped resisting being carried. Imagine how your life would change if you truly believed that God notices you with tenderness, even on the days you feel spiritually empty. Imagine how your burdens would lighten if you trusted that divine love is attracted to your need, not your strength. Imagine how your heart would rest if you understood that God draws closest not when you climb, but when you let him lift you. This is the hidden power Thérèse discovered. The soul rises fastest when it stops trying to rise alone. There is a moment in the spiritual life, quiet, unexpected, almost disarming, when the soul finally understands why the climb felt impossible. It is not because the stairs were too steep. It is not because your will was too weak. It is not because holiness was reserved for someone stronger, more disciplined, more flawless than you. It is because you were never meant to climb in the first place. Let me ask you something sincerely. Have you ever felt a strange relief when you finally stopped fighting to be someone you're not? When you paused long enough to feel the weight of pretending fall from your shoulders? When you realized that God did not ask you to be extraordinary, he asked you to be his? This is the revelation that changed everything for Thérèse. She saw that the staircase to heaven, long imagined as the symbol of ultimate effort, was not her path because it was not God's way. If God wanted to remain distant, perhaps climbing would make sense. If he required heroes, perhaps the stairs would be the test. If he waited at the top, maybe the climb would be necessary. But God does not wait at the top. He comes down. He bends low. He kneels beside the smallest. He lifts what cannot lift itself. Thérèse finally understood that the shortcut to heaven was not a clever technique, not a spiritual hack, not a bypass for the lazy or the weak. It was the natural path for anyone who recognizes the truth. We are children, and children are carried. This realization did not make her complacent. It made her courageous. Because once you stop climbing, you stop fearing every misstep. Once you accept being lifted, you stop panicking about your progress. Once you trust the arms holding you, you stop obsessing about how far you have left to go. Holiness becomes less about performance and more about proximity. Less about achievement and more about attachment. Less about what you do and more about who carries you. Thérèse saw that the soul who lets itself be lifted arrives faster, rises higher, and rests deeper than the soul who climbs alone. The climber trusts their muscles. The little one trusts the heart that holds them. And God delights in the little one because the little one gives him room to be God. Imagine standing at the bottom of a staircase that leads into eternity. You know you cannot reach the top. You know your efforts will fall short. But instead of despair, you lift your arms, not in defeat, but in confidence. Because you know someone will see you, someone will stoop down, someone will carry you with joy. This is the essence of the shortcut. Heaven is not a height you conquer. Heaven is a heart that carries you home. Thérèse refused the stairs because she discovered a love too deep to be earned and too tender to let her climb alone. And once you understand the God she understood, you stop climbing too. Not because you give up, but because you finally trust the one who never needed you to be strong. In the end, there is no shortcut. There is only surrender. And in surrender, you rise.